Pierre Trudeau did a couple of things to make sure Alberta couldn't cash in the way it should. For one, he kept the price of oil in Canada much lower than the world price. So Alberta's oil sold within Canada was much less than the world price. He also put an export tax on Alberta's oil around Western Canadian oil to the United States, because a lot of Western Canadian oil was exported to the United States. So that would be sold to the United States at the world price, and the difference between the Canadian price and the world price, the federal government would take that. So whether Alberta sold its oil within Canada or exported it, we were getting ripped off because the federal government was taking a much larger percentage than it was entitled to. In fact, Peter Lougheed at the time, the Premier, called the export tax on oil the biggest rip-off in Confederation's history up to that point, because there'd never been an export tax on provincial resources before. So there was a big fight, between Peter Lougheed and Pierre Trudeau during the 1970s over oil pricing. There was a brief progressive conservative minority federal government in 1979, but then there was a new federal election in February of 1980. This February 1988 federal election was very different and unique in its own way, because for the first time, the Liberal Party decided to exploit regional grievances as a way of getting them back into power, because Liberals wanted to win Ontario and Quebec, and so they basically said to Ontario and Quebec, re-elect us and we'll put Alberta in its place, because oil pricing was a real big issue at the time. And one of the main Liberal campaign activists at that time said that the unofficial Liberal slogan for that election was, "Screw the West, we'll take the rest." So Trudeau, of course, was re-elected in 1980, and in October of 1980, he introduced the National Energy Program, which was essentially a way for the federal government to take much more control over the West's energy resources. And as a result of Trudeau's policies, there was a change in Alberta's political culture. Like before 1980, whenever a survey was done about Western independence or Alberta independence, the survey results in favor of independence were only in single digits, like 4, 5, 6, or 7%. From 1980 onwards, all the surveys on Western independence have double-digit support. It might be just 15% or 18%, but sometimes it goes to 25% or more. So Pierre Trudeau's attacks on Alberta permanently changed our political culture. Now, despite the increasing support for independence in Alberta, there were still a lot of people who thought we could reform Canada. We could introduce different constitutional changes to make Canada better. And one of those people was Senator Ernest Manning. He had been the longest-serving premier in Alberta, from the 1940s to 1960s. So Manning and a couple of other prominent citizens in 1981 published a book called Regional Representation. It was published by the Canada West Foundation. It was the first major proposal for the Triple E Senate. Now, if you're not familiar with the Triple E Senate, that would be a Senate that would be senators would be elected, there'd be an equal number of senators from every province, and they'd have effective powers. So the Triple E Senate idea became very popular in Alberta and the West, and a lot of people were working towards it, because if we could reform the Constitution in this way, then the West could get its influence within the national government and not feel the need to separate. So there was a lot of people who supported that kind of idea. So Pierre Trudeau resigned in 1984 and was replaced by John Turner. Later that year, Brian Mulroney of the Progressive Conservatives was elected as Prime Minister, and people in Alberta thought things were going to be okay now. Like all of our MPs were Progressive Conservative. Some of them became cabinet ministers. So Brian Mulroney was our guy. We got rid of Trudeau. Everything was going to be okay. But it turned out that's not the way things really work in Canada, because in 1986, Canada had recently bought the CF-18 fighter jets. There was a very big maintenance contract for the CF-18 fighter jets. There was only 2 cities with companies that could maintain the fighter jets. So the federal government held a competition to see which of the companies had the best deal for maintaining them. And Winnipeg, by the government's criteria, Winnipeg won the contract. So the Mulroney government awarded the contract to the company in Montreal, even though Winnipeg had won. So this caused, of course, tremendous anger in Western Canada, and it led to the creation of a new Western movement that would end up becoming the Reform Party of Canada, led by Preston Manning. And one of the brochures written at that time to advocate for the new party was called the New Federal Political Party to Represent the West. It was published in 1987, and this is one of the comments from that brochure. It says, "Throughout our history, Ontario and Quebec have held the lion's share of political influence in Canada, and they continue to dominate the national scene at the expense of the West. Our political and economic development is being hamstrung by the vested interests of the Golden Triangle establishment of Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal." Now that was written 37 years ago, and the exact same words could be written today, because nothing has changed. So the Reform Party won many seats in the West, and especially in Alberta during the 1990s, but over time the Reform Party kind of deviated from its original purpose. It more and more wanted to achieve national power, so it transformed itself into the Canadian Alliance in 2000, and then Stephen Harper became the leader, and he led the Canadian Alliance into a merger with the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada in 2003. He became the leader, of course, of this new Conservative Party of Canada. He was elected Prime Minister in 2006. Now, Stephen Harper was trusted by Westerners and by Albertans. Like, he was an MP from Calgary, right? He'd been one of the original Reform Party MPs. So Westerners trusted Stephen Harper to look after our interests while he was Prime Minister, and there was very little independent sentiment at that time. But of course, in 2015, there was a new federal election, and Justin Trudeau was elected. Of course, Justin Trudeau's, one of his major campaign themes is to deal with climate change. So he had a number of policies and laws that would affect Alberta in a negative way. Of course, there was the No More Pipelines Act and the Alberta tanker ban and other, he wants to do the just transition, so to speak, and transition our workers out of the oil industry. He's got all kinds of these policies that are very harmful to Alberta. So, obviously Albertans don't like him. And so even though the Constitution of Canada gives provinces jurisdiction over natural resources, a lot of Justin Trudeau's policies kind of subvert that intention. They subvert the Constitution's intention of having provincial control over resources. In spite of the fact, though, that they're trying to shut down our oil industry, they're still raking in billions and billions of dollars from that same oil industry. And there's a University of Calgary economist named Robert Manzel. He calculated that from 1965 until 2018, Alberta has made a net contribution to Canada of $630 billion. So that just goes up to 2018, and that's continued on. So, if they recalculated that figures for today, it would be even higher than the $630 billion net contribution to the federal government or to Canada. So that's bad news. I do have good news, though. In the wake of, you probably remember in 1995, Quebec held another independence referendum that almost passed. Now, because of that, the federal government submitted a reference case to the Supreme Court of Canada, asking the Supreme Court of Canada if by Canada's constitutional law, Quebec could unilaterally declare independence from Canada. And the Supreme Court said, no, Quebec cannot unilaterally declare independence from Canada. However, if Quebec held an independence referendum with a clear question, and a clear majority of people voted in favor of it, then the federal government would have an obligation to negotiate Quebec's independence because of that referendum result. So what the Supreme Court of Canada did in that, they created a constitutional pathway for provinces to become independent. So this was specifically for Quebec, but it applies to every province. Canada's constitutional law allows for provinces to become independent, constitutionally and legally. So Alberta could follow that pathway. So just to sum up then, over the period of several decades, there's proposals for how to change Canada to make it more amenable to the West, especially the Tripoli Senate was one of those big proposals people worked on for several years, for decades, and it couldn't be achieved. But most significant of all was the Reform Party of Canada. The Reform Party slogan was "The West wants in." The whole idea of the Reform Party was to make the West feel comfortable within Canada, to give us some influence within the national government so we could be represented there and not feel alienated from the rest of the country. But the Reform Party was unable to achieve its goals. And see, this is the bottom line. If Preston Manning and the Reform Party could not get a Tripoli Senate and otherwise reform Canada's political system, then it can't be done. The West has tried to fix Canada, but Canada does not want to be fixed. Therefore, the only alternative is to get out. There's no other option. Thank you.